Okay, so I hope you're kind of getting the idea from all this that language is pretty complex. If you remember, towards the beginning of the quarter, we kind of talked about like behaviorism and how behaviorism was on the rise for a while because it, uses the scientific method and all of that. And then at some point, there were researchers who basically sort of took down behaviorism, partially by saying it cannot explain how we develop language. Like the fact that we're able to learn these phonemes and the morphemes and the syntax and how they all form together, it's really difficult to explain that in terms of like, reinforcement, and all those things that behaviorists talked about. So then how do we develop language? I'm definitely not going to answer that question in, a single lecture or in the 10 minutes that I'm going to talk about it today, but we'll kind of talk about just some of the basic things of language development. So one thing to know, first of all, about human language development is that the newborn brain is sort of formed to be predisposed to absorb any language that it's exposed to. So we're going to talk in a minute about animals' language abilities. One of the things we know about humans is our brains are just born, to sort of soak up this linguistic information. One kind of important thing I want to emphasize here too is that it doesn't matter the genetic ethnicity of a baby or anything like that. If you take a Chinese baby and you place them in a Spanish environment, they're going to learn Spanish just as easily as they would any other language. So our brains are predisposed to just absorb anything that it's exposed to. And then that exposure is necessary then to, take advantage of that predisposition and allow the infant and baby and toddler to eventually develop their language skills. Language skills tend to develop in a very predictable pattern as long as, a child is developing healthily. Obviously, there can sometimes be issues, where they may need to see a speech pathologist or whatever. But in general, a baby that's developing healthily will follow this pretty predictable pattern. Your textbook lays out quite a bit of details about it, and I don't have them all memorized. But basically, so you start with what's called reflexive communication, which would be things like crying or screaming, basically whenever the baby wants food. So when they start, that's their primary mode of communication. I'm just going to cry anytime I'm hungry or sleepy or cold or hot or whatever. So they have that just sort of reflexive communication. And then over time, they sort of build up more and more complex pieces, and they kind of build up almost in the order that I talked about them. So if you think about an infant, if you've ever been around small babies that are learning to speak, one of the first things they will do is start to form those phonemes. So you might hear them, go like ba 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 ba, or make sounds sort of repetitiously to try to start mastering those different very small components. And then over time, they'll start putting those together until they eventually form words. And then usually they're going to speak in just one word. They might say bottle or mama or blanket or whatever it is they want with just one word. And then they start to build those up, right, into complex sentences. So eventually then the next step's usually going to be a 2-word sentence that has maybe like a verb and a noun. And then they'll build up to more complexity over time. So they tend to follow that predictable pattern. As far as I know, that's pretty common across different cultures and different languages as well. So regardless of what language the baby is learning to speak, they're going to follow that pretty predictable pattern. Sometimes this leads, again, to specific errors. So one error that infants or toddlers often show is what's called overgeneralization. So that's where they learn a rule of grammar, and then they apply that to everything. So they might learn that ed is the past tense, so they'll say runned instead of ran, right? Or they might say mices or mouses, mouses instead of mice, or geese, gooses instead of geese. So they make all these errors where they learn a rule and they just apply it to everything. So then kind of the end stages of mastering language is figuring out all those exceptions to the rules and memorizing them, essentially. Let's see. I already mentioned this, but it's really important that the infant, toddler, child be exposed to certain stimuli during those early years, or else they will often not develop, sort of normally. And we refer to these time periods as critical periods. So a critical period is sort of the time window that a child needs to be exposed to something in order to learn it. And there are critical periods for a lot of different things, not just language, but language is probably one of the most, well-studied critical periods or, well understood. So, you know, have any of you ever tried to learn a language in adulthood? Like learn a new language? I know I've tried a couple times to kind of, you know, dip into a language for a little bit. It's extremely difficult. And part of the reason is because you're past this critical period where it's much easier to absorb language during that time. It gets a lot harder as you get older for various reasons. There's one really tragic example that demonstrates this. I think it's also in your textbook that talks about this girl named Jeannie. I don't think that's her real name, but that's what she was referred to in the study that was done on her. So Jeannie was, she was born to parents who basically did not want her. And so they decided to basically just lock her in a room and not expose her to really anything for the first 13 years of her life, I think. So she was just in this room, you know, very barren, like just a bed. They fed her and, you know, did everything you would need to do to keep a human alive, but she didn't have any interaction with other people, didn't have TV or any kind of media or anything like that. And so at some point, someone realized this was happening, intervened, you know, social services came and took her, and that was, like I said, when she was around 13 years old. And she had no language ability whatsoever. And it's been a while since I've read about this, but I know the researchers and caregivers tried to work on her language ability and basically just could not make any progress with her because she missed that very critical window of time to be exposed to language. So if children are not exposed to it, then, you know, it can lead to all kinds of issues. And there's kind of a gradient there, right? Like the more language you're exposed to as a kid, the better able you're going to be to master the language. So that's why, you know, reading to children and giving them books and things in childhood is so important. Okay, so I have one video that goes a little bit more specific about kind of this process of how children learn phonemes specifically that I think is pretty interesting. So I'm going to play the video. It's a little lengthier. And then we can kind of talk about it if there's any questions or anything about this. So again, it's going to kind of show part of the process of how children learn the phonemes for their specific language.
The most successful of these tasks take advantage of responses that infants naturally make. And in the conditioned head turn procedure, what we do is we teach babies to turn their head not just when they detect a noise or a sound, but when they detect a change from one sound category to another. It had been shown in previous work that young babies seem to be able to discriminate sounds from any of the world's languages, but that adults, like us, have difficulty hearing sound differences that are not used in our own language. I guess the most famous example there is the difficulty that Japanese adults have hearing the difference between ra and la. So I wanted to know, when does this change occur? And in a series of studies, we ascertained that there are important changes occurring during the first year of life. And that's when we honed in on testing infants of 6 to 8, 8 to 10, and 10 to 12 months of age on their ability to discriminate a native sound distinction, the ba-da, as well as a non-native distinction, in this case, two Ds that are used in Hindi but not English, da, da.
Da. Da.
Look at the bunny.
Da.
In the conditioned head turn procedure, the infant sits on their mother's lap in a testing room. Across the table from the mother and infant, an experimental assistant sits and quietly shows the baby toys to keep him or her entertained and focused straight ahead. In the background, they're being presented with sounds. Then after a number of repetitions, the computer operator in the adjacent control room pushes a button on the computer to indicate that it's time to change to a new sound.
Da.
You teach the child to turn their head every time they detect a sound change. There's a training phase where every trial involves a change from one sound to another with the immediate activation of a reinforcer. Then there's a conditioning phase where you gradually delay turning on the reinforcer, hoping that the child will make an anticipatory head turn. Then after they've reached some kind of criterion, we have 3 consecutive anticipatory head turns, then you go into the testing phase.
Da.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there and just kind of re-describe some of what she was saying. I went forward again when I didn't mean to, so just ignore this for a little bit. So I wanted to show you the video because it's very difficult to sometimes talk about how researchers work with infants. Because if you think about, we're trying to understand development. If I have a 6-month-old baby, it's not like I can just be like, hey, do you understand verbs yet? And then they can be like, yeah, I do, right? Because they're not speaking yet. So we have to come up with really creative ways to test these infants and their abilities. So what she was doing was trying to train these infants to just turn their head whenever they hear the sound change from one phoneme to another. So in the training, it was, saying ba, ba, ba. And then whenever it says da, so it switches from a B to a D, we want the infant to turn their head to basically show that they heard that difference. So they do that training phase for a while. Then they shift to the testing phase where they test how many different phonemes can this infant discriminate between. So she mentioned, I talked about how there's all these different phonemes that, we can make with our mouth, and yet different languages have different sets. And she gave some examples. So like in Hindi, there's 2 D sounds that to any native English speaker, it would be almost impossible to hear the difference between them. Like they would both just sound like da, but to someone who's grown up speaking Hindi, they could hear the difference between those two syllables. She gave the other example that in English, we have like an R and an L sound, a ra and a la, but in Japanese, they don't have those 2 different phonemes. They only have one for that, so it's harder for them to distinguish between them. So they do this task with the infants, and then they test. Can they hear the difference between ra and la? Can they hear the difference between these 2 different D sounds? And what they find that's really interesting is that infants like 9 months and earlier, they can discriminate all the different phonemes. So they can hear all the different phonemes in English, Hindi, Japanese, all the different languages. At about 9 months, they start to shift to where they can only discriminate the ones that are in their native language, but they can no longer discriminate the ones that are in languages that are not being used. So if they're not hearing Hindi, they're not exposed to that, then they lose that ability to discriminate between those 2 different D sounds. So that's kind of demonstrating what I was talking about earlier. You're born with this ability where you could theoretically learn any of the world's different languages, but once you're exposed to one language repeatedly every single day through your parents, your caregivers, etc., your brain starts to shift to like, I'm going to prioritize this language because it seems really important. I'm going to put lots of resources into understanding this, and I'm going to get rid of any of these resources that helped me, hear the difference between da and da because I don't need that. I'm never going to use it. So that's part of why that critical period is so important, because you need that exposure in order for your brain to kind of shape itself to pick up that specific language. Yeah, Alex.
Have there been any kind of like long-term studies where they've tried to expose a child to the a diversity of languages that include all the different phonemes, and then see as they get older if they somehow if they get past through that point, if they're actually better at distinguishing all of them throughout any language,
right,
as adults?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I would guess probably a study like that in an experimental method has probably not been done, where like we're going to take these babies and we're going to, this half we're going to expose them to lots of them, right? But probably there's correlational research that looks at like, infants that are exposed to lots of languages early on in childhood, like maybe they're, coming from, parents and backgrounds that speak lots of different languages. I would guess there's got to be studies that look at the correlation between that and this ability to hear different phonemes. I haven't read them, so I don't know them off the top of my head, but that would be really interesting to look into. I feel like, again, if I've read them, it's been a really long time. I feel like probably research that looks at infants that are growing up bilingual or with multiple languages, they probably would have an easier time learning more languages in the future. Yeah, but I don't know that for 100% certainty off the top of my head.
Previously, you said there's usually like a specific number of phonemes within each individual language.
Yep.
Do you think there's maybe some kind of like limitation? Like, do we have a specific set of or a specific memory that we have for these specific kind of things? And then most humans usually have a range of them which they're prepared to learn. And
right.
We kind of do maybe have a maximum.
Maybe. So you're kind of asking, like, is there some bottleneck where we can only learn a certain number, so therefore we're going to stop at that number, no matter how many languages we're exposed to? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's entirely possible. I feel like the range of phonemes in different languages is pretty variable. Okay. So there are some languages that have just a very few, and then there's some that have, I think, up to like 40 or something. So that would make me think probably not but maybe. But there probably is an upper limit somewhere. I just don't know what it is. Yeah, good questions. Any other questions or comments about development? Again, it's, obviously massively more complex than that, and we could talk a lot about how very specific aspects of language develop, but for time's sake, I think we'll move on. Okay, so, we typically, most of us are going to develop with one or maybe a couple of languages that we can speak in our, childhood and that we carry over into adulthood. There's this theory that's called linguistic relativity. This theory has lots of different names, but this is the one I'm going to stick with. If you're interested in knowing more, it's also sometimes called the Whorfian hypothesis. Because the researcher who originally came up with it was named Whorf, so that's where that comes from. So basically, this is this theory that the language that we speak has pretty profound influences on the way that we also think and perceive the world. So kind of the idea is that someone who grows up speaking English, that they would think and perceive the world very differently from someone who speaks a different language, And there's kind of different extremes of this theory. So the most extreme one, the Whorfian hypothesis, basically says that if you speak one language, then you are incapable of thinking the same way that someone who speaks a different language does. So it's a very extreme theory, which is not very well supported. Linguistic relativity more just says the language you speak influences the way you think, but you could still, come up with ways to think the same way that someone that speaks another language does. So let me give you some examples of this because I think it'll make a lot more sense what I'm talking about. So there's a few studies that have tried to look at, let's find some differences across languages in the way that they talk about different concepts, and let's see if that influences their behavior or their performance on different tasks. So one of these was looking at this difference between the way that English speakers and Mandarin speakers conceive of time. So in English, often when we talk about time, we talk about it as being in a horizontal plane. So I can move forward in time and I can move backward in time, right? But in Mandarin, they talk about it that way, but they also talk about time as being vertical. So they talk about, I always mix up which it is. I think the future is below and the past is above. So if they're talking about the past, they'll talk about time being up or above them. So it's just a different way of sort of conceptualizing time. So what they did in this study, they took people who are native English speakers, people who are native Mandarin speakers, and they had them do all these different tasks to try to, very quickly answer questions about different associations between time. So, the questions are really simple. They're questions that probably all of us could answer, but the main thing they're looking at is how fast they can answer those questions. So they would ask them, for example, which month comes first, June or September, right? And then they would see how quickly can they answer that question. And what they found is that the Mandarin speakers were actually better at a lot of those tasks, that they could answer them more quickly, and they guessed that it's because they have sort of this more complex way of conceptualizing time that gives them kind of an advantage, basically. A lot of studies have also looked at how we use language to describe colors and how that affects our performance on these different color tasks. So the ones that I have found at least there's some that look at English versus Dani, and then some that look at English versus Russian. I think there's also other languages that are included as well. But basically all these different languages have very different ways of categorizing colors. So in English we have our basic, color words, orange, yellow, red, blue, etc. Different languages have different sets of words that describe kind of different colors, basically. The one I know the best about is this Dani language basically has really fine-grained words for how they describe blues. So they have words that mean kind of like light blue and dark blue, which, in English, I could say light blue and dark blue, but they have actual words that very specifically describe those. And so they have people who speak all these different languages do tasks like this one. This does not work super well on a projector. But, these are different shades of kind of teal, basically. All of these are the same, and this one is slightly different. So it's kind of hard to see that, which is kind of the point. So they would show, the participants stimuli like these, and they have to indicate which square is the different one, right? So the correct answer would be to just click on that one. And they find that whenever they do it with shades of blue, the Dani speakers excel at this task. So they can do it very quickly. They can discriminate colors that are more similar than the English speakers. I can't remember the specific details with Russian, but it was something very similar where like they have a certain set of words that describe a color, you know, that we don't have in English, and they're able to actually perceive a difference in those colors that we do not perceive. So that kind of suggests that our language actually impacts our perception of colors, essentially. And then this is the last example. So they looked at this use of agency or sort of activeness in a sentence. So in English, we tend to use lots of active sentences to describe things. So active would be saying like, I am holding the marker, right? The passive version of that would be to just say the marker is being held. So there's no like agency in that sentence. And it turns out, I guess, in Japanese speakers, it's very common that if there's some kind of like accident that happens, they avoid using the active voice. So if, you know, I could say like, I tripped and fell, or let's say, you know, I broke the vase, would be the English way of saying it. In Japanese, I guess they would say that the vase was broken, basically. So they had, basically what they did is they showed Japanese speakers and English speakers a bunch of videos of people doing things like that, like accidental things where they broke something or they tripped someone. And then they tested them later on their memory of who committed the accident. And it turns out that the English speakers were better able to remember who committed the accident compared to the Japanese speakers. So it suggested that, again, sort of that thought of like thinking in passive terms sort of made it so that they don't really necessarily linger on like who committed the accident. They can move on or forget about it, basically. So all those would suggest like, yeah, maybe the language we speak influences the way that we perceive the world. I will say with some of these studies, they've done it where they then train like the different languages to think a different way. So like with the English one, they actually took some of the English-speaking participants and they trained them for like a couple hours to think about time vertically as well as horizontally, and then they could perform the task just as well as the Mandarin speakers. So that kind of rules out the like really hard, extreme Whorfian hypothesis, and basically just says the language we speak influences the way we think, but we can change the way we think by being exposed to new material or new concepts. All right, any questions about that theory or idea, linguistic relativity? Okay, I think we're still on language, but I think now is a good time to take a break because we're going to shift to talking about language and animals, and I have like a ton of different examples of this that'll take a decent amount of time, so I think now would be a good time to take a short break. So if you want, take about 5 minutes, go get a drink of water, go use the restroom, do whatever you want to do, stretch if you need to.